Texas was still a very young state in 1861, only being admitted to the Union a few years before, in 1845. The United States annexed Texas in 1845, and the year later, in April, erupted with the Mexican-American War over territorial disputes. Lots of commanders who served here at Antietam actually got their first combat experience during the Mexican-American War. Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, served with the engineers, as did the commander of the Army of the Potomac, George McClellan. George Meade was also an engineer, as well as William C. Wofford, who commanded the Texas Brigade. He was a member of the Georgia Mounted Volunteers. Others included James Longstreet, a captain in the 8th United States Infantry. Most people migrated to Texas in the 1840s in exchange for land grants, which would guarantee them some of Texas's fine soil for farming. Many deep Southerners would move here, especially to East Texas, where soil was perfect for cotton farming, and because Texas was to be a slave state. Germans also came here by the thousands in the 1848 aftermath, where many revolutions took place across Europe. In the 1840s, just 70,000 people lived in Texas, but by 1850, 212,000 called Texas their home. By 1860, 604,000 people, a dramatic rise in population just before secession. It should be announced, however, that in 1860, 30% of this population were slaves. Texas seceded from the Union on the 1st of February, 1861, by a vote of 76%. The governor at the time, Sam Houston, was actually kicked out for being pro-Union and was replaced by Lieutenant Governor Edward Clark before Francis Lubbock was elected in November. Texas was vital to the Southern economy thanks to its good ports on the Gulf of Mexico and its production of cotton, lumber, and cattle. The 1st Texas, or the Ragged Old First, had been mustered into Confederate service on the 1st of June, 1861 in Richmond. They had fought at the battles of Seven Pines/Fair Oaks, all of the 7 days battles in June of 1862. In August, they had fought at 2nd Manassas, and just a few days prior to the battle here at Antietam, they had fought at South Mountain. These were commanded by Colonel A.T. Rainey before he was wounded at Gaines' Mill during the 7 days. He was replaced by Philip Work, a Kentucky lawyer who had moved to Texas when he was just a young boy in 1838. He had fought with a mounted battalion of Texas Volunteers in 1853 against the Comanche, and had been part of the United States Army when his unit had folded. He commanded the Woodville Rifles, which were later named Company H of the 1st Texas, and here at Antietam he was just 30 years old. A few days before the Battle of Antietam on September 14th, the 1st Texas had fought at Fox's Gap on South Mountain. They had held the Union 9th Corps for a couple of hours with their comrades before having to retire in the night. They managed to repulse multiple attacks, including killing Jesse Reno, the commander of 9th Corps, who was just 39 at the battle. Brigadier General John Bell Hood received an urgent plea from Brigadier General Alexander Lawton at around 7 a.m. Lawton desperately needed its support, as his units were being pushed back by an advancing federal line. Hood's division consisted of Hood's Brigade, under the command of Colonel William T. Wofford. Wofford's men included the 18th Georgia, Hampton's Legion from South Carolina, and the 1st, 4th, and 5th Texas. The other brigade was under command of Colonel Evander Law, who commanded the 4th Alabama, the 2nd and 11th Mississippi, as well as the 6th North Carolina. The 1st Texas had been waiting in the West Woods and eating their breakfast when they received the orders. However, they still had to wait for the official move out. Corporal W.D. Pritchard of the 1st Texas told about his experience. Standing inactive, conscious of an unseen danger, with bullets whizzing over and around them, the increasing rattle of musketry in front, with now and then the ominous shriek of a shell as it tears through the ranks, the strain upon the man is terrible. The morning of September 17, 1862, the Union 1st Corps, under the command of Joseph Hooker, advanced out of the North Woods behind me across this cornfield. Their target was the Dunker Church. It was an easily identifiable building because it was white, and a position there would allow them to put flanking fire onto the Confederate center. By putting Union artillery on Nicodemus Heights and Hauser Ridge, they would be able to fire into the flanks of D.H. Hill. By unraveling his line, they could forced the Confederates entirely off of the ridge and back across the Potomac. At 6 a.m., a Union division under the command of Brigadier General James Ricketts advances out of the North Woods behind me and into this cornfield owned by Daniel Miller. Confederate artillery positions on Nicodemus Heights and by the Dunkard Church, a huge battery of 35 guns under the command of Colonel Stephen Lee, hit their positions hard, as well as infantry fire from Lawton's brigade under Marcellus Douglas. Confederate brigades weren't numbered like Union units. They were named after their former commanders, or the commanders serving on that day. After a huge firefight that lasted about an hour, finally, Union troops of the Iron Brigade under John Gibbon advanced along the Hagerstown Pike and rout Marcellus Douglas's flank. Wofford's men began their advance at the Dunkard Church, behind the tree at the left of the screen. They crossed this 250 yards of open field to engage Doubleday and Ricketts' divisions along that fence line at the edge of the cornfield. Wofford's men were unable to fire because Confederate troops retreating from the area prevented them from firing into their own men, and Union artillery at the Poffenberger farm and along the Hagerstown Pike bombarded their positions, forcing them to move. Ricketts and Doubleday were forced back, and George Meade positioned his Pennsylvania reserves along that fence line at the other edge of the cornfield to receive the Confederate counterattack. However, things weren't going so well for the Confederacy in other places. Evander Law's brigade was thrown back by the entirety of the 12th Corps of Joseph Mansfield arriving from the north and the east woods. Out of the west woods came Marcina Patrick's New Yorkers and into the flank of Wofford, drawing out the 18th Georgia, the 4th Texas, and Hampton's Legion. The 1st Texas was here alone in the cornfield, facing the entirety of the Bucktails Division under George Meade. Much to Hood's chagrin, the 1st Texas were 150 yards away from where they needed to be. He stated that, quote, they had slipped the bridle and got away from the command. Lieutenant Colonel Work, in command of the 1st Texas, stated, quote, as soon as the enemy became engaged, much to Hood's chagrin, the 1st Texas was 150 yards away from where they needed to be. He stated that they had, quote, slipped the bridle and got away from the command. Lieutenant Colonel Work of the 1st Texas stated that, quote, as soon as the regiment became engaged with the enemy in the cornfield, it became impossible to restrain the men as they rushed forward, pressing the enemy. That enemy was Lieutenant Colonel Richard Anderson's Pennsylvania Reserves, the 9th, the 10th, the 11th, and the 12th. They waited at that fence line until the Confederacy was just 10 yards away before raising their musketry and opening fire. Captain Dunbar's artillery, just at that ridge behind me, began firing as well and absolutely pounded the 1st Texas. They were entirely alone with no support on either side or to their rear, and the blue tide began to push them back with heavy casualties. In the confusion here, Captain James Woodward of the 1st Texas yelled, the flags, where are the flags? As he couldn't find either. Apparently, the colors were still left behind in the cornfield while the 1st Texas was retreating, and 9 color bearers were shot down as the 9th Pennsylvania Reserves took their prize, the 1st Texas's regimental flag. The 1st Texas suffered tremendously. 186 of their 226 men were killed, wounded, or captured, for a casualty rate of a staggering 82%, which was the highest of any regiment on either side of the Civil War. Hood's division didn't fare any better, with 60% casualties on that day. He now sent his men to a position along Smoketown Road just behind the Dunkard Church, where they would face the brunt of the attack of Joseph Mansfield's 12th Corps, Joe Hooker's 1st Corps, and the arrival of 2nd Corps under Edwin Sumner. After the battle, Lee asked where Hood's division was, to which he replied, quote, they are lying on the field where you sent them. My division has been almost wiped out.